today, as part of the LAC 2020 virtual conference, I will present you some work done with my former PhD student Fatima Arak and two colleagues from Sorbonne University and Grenoble-Alpes University in France, Wendell Wengo and Pierre Gillois. So you will have a version of this slide available in the URL that is indicated here, and as you can read, the goal of this work was to evaluate the teacher's perception of different students' question organization in a blended learning context. There we go. So like I've just said, our focus here is to analyze students' question. So students' question have an important role in the learning processes. They help the students to improve their level because they are able to express their misunderstanding, and that's the first step towards resolving them. And also they are important for the teachers because they help the teacher to adapt the pace or the content of their class to the students' need, providing a much needed feedback on where they need to focus, which aspect they need to develop. Unfortunately, when we are in an online context, such as a MOOC, where the volume of questions can become really massive and it's becoming hard to treat. Moreover, in this online context, the teacher don't necessarily know the students as well as they did in a traditional classroom context. So when I receive a question as a teacher, I don't necessarily know where that person is speaking from. And in that case, it can become very tricky to deal with this question. For instance, very concretely, if I have only time to answer to a subset of questions, which one I should answer to first? Which ones correspond to students for whom my answer can really make a difference? For instance, if I choose to answer to a very advanced question from an excellent student, I may be helping her in her understanding, but nobody else is able to understand that because they are still struggling with more simpler concepts. Conversely, if I answer to a question from a student who clearly hasn't taken the time to carefully review the material provided, it is not sure that it will be enough to make a difference for him or her, and it could be wiser to actually advise them to go and do that effort first. So the idea is that, okay, in an ideal world with an infinite time, every question should probably be answered, but it's just not very often possible in practice, and choices must be made. And that's even more true in our particular context that I will describe just after. So just to summarize, or if someone is joining the presentation right now, what is our goal here? Simply put, we want to provide teacher with additional information that is going to help them to choose better which questions to answer. And for that, previous work we have presented in the past year to this community can help us. Indeed, we have previously shown that if we are able to categorize the type of question asked by students in a blended learning or in a MOOC, we can somehow help the teacher and use the type of question to better understand what they want. And we can also use that information to predict some of the characteristics of the learner who asked similar question in previous years. I will get back to that. So therefore, the focus that we have here is really how to provide this information to teachers to best fit their needs. It's really a question of how do I give that information to the teacher. So for this, we are getting back to a blended learning context in which students ask questions before a Q&A session with their teacher, and the teacher uses those questions to interact with them during the Q&A. So before diving more into the context, let's take a couple of minutes to review some related work. So to our knowledge, and according to a recent review by Daniel McNamara and colleagues, it seems that the problem of students' questions in our community has been mostly analyzed from two main angles. The first one is how to provide automatic answers to students' questions mostly in the context of intelligent tutoring systems, such as AutoTutor or iStart. And the other angle is how can we find questions that are related to a reference text, which is one of the possibilities opened by a tool like ReaderBench that is developed by Daskalu and colleagues. But the question of how to present that the information on question hasn't really been explored so much as far as we know in the learning analytics community. So as we have stated before, one point that we want to investigate here is how students' profile or the nature of the question that they ask are relevant, and in particular if it's one of them or both of them combined that could be the best option. Indeed, if we look at the literature, there are reasons to believe that both approaches can be valuable. Indeed, there are several work that show that if I know better who my students are as a teacher, I will be able to better allocate my time and to try to maximize the learning for everyone. On the other hand, there is another line of work that shows that if I know exactly what my student wants, for instance, if I understand what is really behind the question that is being asked to me, it can benefit to the general learning performance of everyone. So both approaches seem potentially relevant here, and it appears that they haven't really been investigated in the context of students' question, which is what we are going to do here. So let's move on now to our pedagogical context. So the work that we have done here is in a very specific context where we have data set of questions asked by first-year medical students who are following a specific hybrid training system. So it's a very particular context here because we are in a highly competitive setting. Indeed, in France, due to the regulation in the number of medical doctors to be trained every year, the main filter actually happened at the end of the first year of medical study, and only the top 200 students are accepted in year 2. So it's not really the grade that matters. You can be an excellent student. If your ranking is not high enough at the end of the year, you will only have the possibility to redo the class. And this competitive context makes it really critical for each group of students to be treated in a fair manner by the teacher. For instance, the student cannot come and complain that another group of students or another particular student has been receiving more attention from the teacher, because that would be breaking the equality of the contest between them. So in that particular training, we have each course of each class that is following a pattern of 4 weeks. So in week 1, in a particular domain, the students are going to learn online from home or from wherever they want, using resources, viewing videos, and reading provided text. In week 2, they have a platform that is open to them where they can connect and ask a question about the course that they have read. So they can see other questions from students in their group, and they can vote on those questions, but they do not have the possibility of answering to those questions. Even if they know the answer. Again, this is due to the competitive nature of the context, because teachers tell us that actually there are sometimes answers that are not good or that could be confusing, and even questions that can be meant to confuse other students. In week 3, there is actually the Q&A session that's happening with the teacher and the student being in the same room. And that's that's when the teacher is using the email that he has received with a summary of all the questions asked by the student in his group. And he's supposed to select some in order they want, and maybe not all of them will be answered, and they will give an answer to those questions collectively. And finally, in week 4, which we are not going to talk about here, the students take a test and they train on the course and do a correction again collectively. So now that I think hopefully we are clear on the context, what are we proposing here? Well, what we want is to offer to teachers something better than a mere list of questions that they receive currently by email, to help them choose the question that they want to answer in their Q&A session. And for that, I need to take a step back and to re-explain a little bit how we have additional information on the questions asked by the students. So quickly, in the previous work, we have proposed a coding scheme. So that was, I think, at LAC 2018 in Sydney. We have proposed this coding scheme that is made of 4 mostly independent dimensions. So we have NLP tools that are helping us to automatically tag a question according to these dimensions. And this coding scheme, the idea behind it is that we want to provide question category that take into account the student's intention. So we want to help feed the teacher's reflection in order for them to react differently with students' question, and to maybe group question based on these intentions. So for instance, if I'm not going to detail the coding scheme, I can get back to it if you have questions, but just to illustrate how it works, if I have the following sentence, it would be annotated as a request to go beyond what's already given in the course, and in order to explain a link between 2 concepts. So that's the first information that we have. The second information that we have is coming from another work that we published last year in the Journal of Learning Analytics, where we have shown that we can perform some clustering based on students' questions from 1 year and find a correlation between the profile of students in each cluster and other variables that were not used in the clustering. So we do the clusters only based on the questions asked, and we can relate it to variables such as attendance in class or whether they are retaking the class or not. And those profiles of clusters can be helpful for the teacher. So that's the part on top of the drawing here. And what's even more interesting is that we have shown that if we have determined cluster over 1 year, but if we try to reapply this partition of space that we obtained from the cluster over another year, we see that it works well, and that the question asked by students in a new year are similar to the question asked in the previous year. So the clusters are similar in terms of characteristics. So in other words, I don't need to wait to have an elaborate question profile which can take months to collect. When I have a new student coming in after a few questions that he has asked on the online platform, I can try to match them with a cluster from the previous year, and it is likely that he or she shares the characteristic of this particular cluster. So then I could provide to the teacher an information such as, well, based on the question asked by the student and what we know of students who are normally asking this type of question, he or she must have this or that type of profile. So now that we have these two information, let's remember what our goal is we want to help teachers to choose students' question, and for that we have seen that we can compute additional information that goes beyond the number of votes on that question, which is currently the only information the teacher has. So based on what I've just presented, there are three types of question organization that we can think about. The first one is based on, we call it based on students' pedagogical needs, because we are using the intent behind the question. So we are using the coding scheme to add information automatically to the question. The second one is based on the student's likely profile using the clusters I've explained. And the third one is basically a combination of the first two, where we have both information about the type of the question and the profile of the student asking this question. So concretely, what are those question organization looking like? Well, they look like this, and this is actually a screenshot of what we were presenting to the teacher in the questionnaire we sent them that I'm going to present just after. So this organization is centered on the student's needs. So the idea is that we try to group the question based on the first dimension of our coding scheme, which was trying to distinguish if a question was more based on a re-explanation or something going further, or just a verification of something that the student thinks they have understood. And we're also using the fourth dimension, which talk about the type of verification the students want to do. So is it do they want to know if something is to learn for the final exam, for instance? That's the last case here. Or do they actually point out something that they think is contradictory between two information given in the course? That's a different type of category. So based on this, we could provide something that looks like this to the teacher, where you don't have only question 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. You have some kind of structure here, and you can decide as a teacher, okay, I will maybe focus on this, on that. We are not giving any information on what the teacher should do, just how it looks like. The second organization is based on the student's profile. So here we rely on the cluster that we previously obtained. So in particular, across all the courses, we have seen that there are three consistent clusters, what we call here A, B, and D. This is just arbitrary names. And so the first cluster corresponds to students who are not asking many questions, who are attending less than average to the Q&A session, and who mostly ask questions of explanation or redefinition of things that are already in the course. But in terms of vote, their questions are popular. They receive a lot of votes from other students. So we nickname them struggling passive students because they are not very active and they need some basic explanation. The second category that we have here are the nitpicking active. So that's basically students that have high grade, that tend to be there very often, but they include many questions from students who are actually retaking the course from a previous year. And those questions tend to be very, very picky, very precise, and which makes them not very popular overall. So they don't receive many votes. And finally, the last category that we have here involves students with overall high grades who ask popular questions and who mostly try to verify their knowledge. So based on this, we can propose an organization that looks like this, where we have like three categories, and basically help the teacher in selecting those questions by telling them, okay, this is a question that have been asked by what we think is a student with this profile. And finally, the last organization, we mix the two previous ones, like I've said. So you find here the organization that was from the first organization, where we have the structure of the question. And we add information on the profile of the student who asked this question using columns here. So for instance, not only do we know that the student who asked this information here about do we need to learn this for the final exam, but we also know that this student is probably belonging to the average category of students. So how do we evaluate the potential for those three representations? Well, for that, we conducted a survey that was sent by email to all the teachers who intervened in that first year of medical students training. And that's what I'm going to analyze now. So that survey was made of 28 questions, which I'm not all going to present. This is a synthesis, and you have some more information in the paper. We had 36 teachers who replied to that questionnaire. And so that was not bad, considering that there were probably around 50 teachers involved in this training. The first section included questions that were to ensure that we had enough diversity among our respondents. So in terms of experience with this teaching, the perception that they have of the flipped classroom approach. So if we analyze globally the result, we see that the teacher considered that the questions received are moderately numerous. Well, we have variation from some that think that they don't have enough and some who think that they have too many questions. They find that the questions are quite disorganized, which makes sense considering what they receive right now by email, and it confirms the potential interest for an alternative organization. And overall, they think that those questions are helpful to prepare for the Q&A session. I think there was only one teacher who declared that he was completely ignoring them, but so overall, they read the question and they try to use them. So those questions are overall related to the course, they think, but they are not necessarily very original. They tend to be similar from one year to the next. And in terms of perception, they all think that the flipped classroom approach is fairly easy to deal with, but some teachers are complaining that it's taking them a lot of time and energy to prepare. So if we ask them to choose, we have asked them to evaluate individually each type of organization and to give us some feedback, but if we look at the question where we actually ask them between the four organizations, which one do you want if you have to choose only one? And so I'm saying four organizations because you have the three ones I've presented here, plus the last one, which is basically a lack of organization. It's just a list of questions with votes. So when we ask them which one do you prefer, we see that there is a clear split between the answers. So we have three organizations, including the current one, who receive actually 11 votes, and one organization, that is the one based on students' profile, that is receiving less votes than other. So we believe that the problem with this one was probably, one of the hypotheses that we have was that the label of the categories, which was like struggling, average, and good, was somehow giving to some teacher the implicit suggestion that behind this wording was that one should focus more on questions from the good student. And that was very visible in the comment because we were also asking them a free text question to explain to us what they were thinking about this organization. And those who really disliked it were thinking that we were suggesting that they should focus on the question from the good students, which was not our intent here. But they feel that either them could be tempted to do that or some colleagues could be tempted to focus on questions from students who are probably going to go on with medical study, and that they would ignore the question from other students who are, so to speak, not worth their time. So if we go on, we see that there is no consensus over a particular organization, and that raises a new kind of question. Why is there no consensus, or should we expect a consensus in the first place? So since we had information about the diversity of profile between the teacher, we wondered if maybe this somehow explained why some teachers preferred a type of organization over another one. So what we did is we tried to answer this question, we tried to perform a clustering analysis of teachers based on the variable I presented earlier from the questionnaire, and which relate to their experience in the Q&A session and their perception of the flipped classroom approach. So the underlying hypothesis here was that maybe teachers who feel more or less at ease with the approach that we give them would have different opinion on what could be useful to them. And indeed, we had two different clusters that emerged. We have a cluster one with teachers who are more junior, who report receiving more questions and generally didn't have time to address most of them, and that impact their perception of the flipped classroom that they appreciate somehow less than the other cluster. And the other cluster, logically, it's more senior teachers who are receiving or declare receiving less questions and therefore consider that they can answer to most of them, and they consider that they like the flipped classroom principle. So although we have two very clear clusters, unfortunately our hypothesis was not verified, as there was no statistically significant relationship between the clusters and the choice of one particular organization of questions. So it seems that other factors may explain these choices, and one that has appeared retrospectively was the teacher's ability to generate idea of how they could use an organization of questions in their practice. And it's almost relate to some philosophical stance on whom one should focus on as a teacher, which are things that we were not asking them in the original questionnaire. So time to wrap up. What are the conclusions of all this? Well, we have seen that we are able to come with different question organization to propose to teacher to help them in their practice of the flipped classroom, and which provide information on students' pedagogical need. So based on the nature of the question they ask or on students' profile, in particular their level. However, when presenting those alternatives to teacher, there was no consensus over one organization. And when we try to see why is that, well, we think that there could be limit in the way we conducted this experiment. The first one is that we could not interview the teachers for logistical reason. It was not possible. So we relied on the questionnaire. And that questionnaire, even if it was very rich with 28 questions and that we collected a lot of information, was not necessarily investigating all the dimensions that could have been relevant. And we could not, like, when we were seeing that the teacher was not necessarily understanding the goal behind an organization, we could not correct them on that. Some design choices can also have affected the result in the label that we used. And explaining the potential option on or how the question organization were built could have changed the answers, but we could not do that here. Now, in terms of perspective, this work reveals that in that case, as is very often, maybe we don't have one-size-fits-all approach that could work, and maybe instead we should consider proposing various organizations and let teachers pick the one that speaks the most to them, or if we can finally identify factors that correlate with their preferences, we could orient teachers toward the type of question that is the best tailored to their needs. Another option that appeared in the free text and question that we collected, that I didn't mention too much here, is that several teachers had interesting idea on the order in which to address the question or the priority to give to a certain type of question. And we could maybe consider building upon those ideas and include them with the question organization. So basically, instead of just providing, here is what your student asked, we could say, here is how you could use this information concretely to adapt it to your pedagogy. So that's it. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to now answer to some questions. And if I fail now, you can either follow up with me later in the virtual room or through Twitter, or if it's a more technical question that I failed to address, send an email to the first author.